7 players who are underrated by opponents. I.e. the inverse of yesterday's video. Ergo, please see the intro of that one for a better understanding of the method of judgment. Let's roll on. Number 7. Frank Lampard. We start with a very classic example of being underrated because he didn't play up against you. Frank Lampard didn't go in 100 miles per hour into everything like Steven Gerrard. He didn't jump into crazy tackles like Paul Scholes. He didn't physically run you over like Yaya Toure. And that is why when asked to recall their toughest opponent, no fellow midfielder ever really thinks of Lamps. Because as we've learned yesterday, unless you do something akin to what I've just listed, you just don't leave that strong of an impression on your opponent. But is it really accurate to imply he wasn't hard? Because you see, for the position Lamps played for Chelsea, his job was to, yes, run games and play the final ball, qualities of his which itself is underrated, but more importantly, make that late run into the box to finish off attacks. This is how he scored so many of his 211 goals for the club. And as an opposing midfielder on defensive duty, surely it was your job to track or make sure he doesn't find the space and time to arrive late. And if you fail to do that, which midfielders I hear have done so somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 times, I'm sure that's more than enough evidence that Lamps wasn't exactly easy to handle. And while none have said precisely that, as far as just how hard Lamps was to deal with, they should certainly in some instances say at least just a little more. Number 6. Marcelo. Ties in with what I've spoken about a few times before. When it comes to being a pure defender, Marcelo is undoubtedly amongst the most underrated of his generation. Once he matured around 2014 post that 7-1 humiliation, he had many of Europe's best wingers on lock. Besides, let's not forget kids, another way fullbacks can make it difficult for wingers outside directly defending against them is by pinning them back by attacking in the opposite direction. And well, people talk about Dani Alves doing that, but Marcelo was better going forward than Dani Alves. No question about it. Hell, he was one of the most integral parts of Zizou's last 2 three-peat sides when they switched to a 4-4-2 and the width was coming from the high-up fullbacks. This really interrupted the game plan of many of the more attacking sides in Europe during those Champions League campaigns, with the majority of Real's threat coming from those wide areas. Crazy how the opposing wingers seem to forget this. But hey, maybe they just weren't paying attention, and maybe that's why they kept losing. Number 5. Park Ji-sung. He only passed 20 league games in 2 of his 7 seasons at Manchester United. He was only really a starter for 1 of those seasons. And in all honesty, despite the shower of praise he gets from his teammates, Park Ji-sung was a fair bit from being world class. But even so, very few players have made the lives of specific world class opponents a misery like this man has. You see, CR7 is usually labelled as the player for the big occasion, though the way I see it, he's more of the player for every occasion. Park Ji-sung was truly the player for the big occasion, and at times only the big occasion, with his performances directly against names such as Cesc Fabregas, Andre Pirlo and Steven Gerrard over the years helping him gain a cult following at Old Trafford. And as Sir Alex Ferguson once said, which in all honesty I don't entirely disagree with, had he brought G on at half-time at Wembley in 2011 and stuck him on Messi, it may really have been a different story that night. That's how strong this man was at man-to-man marking, which is why it is a tad strange that not many of the men he's marked out of matches of monumental magnitude this millennium have spoken about him being a tough opponent. Might have something to do with him being pretty forgettable in general, but if you ask these players to recall the specific day they had to deal with him, especially Andre Pirlo, I'm sure he'd start shivering in cold sweat before he even utters G's name. Number 4. Angel Di Maria. I'm not running out of options. There's a legit reason why this name keeps popping up on the underrated side of videos. And this in particular, well, is just a little baffling. Because as I said, players who are usually underrated by opponents are ones who don't leave an impression as far as giving them a physical battle and or taking them on and leaving them for dead. Well, Di Maria did that, did it on a regular basis, and did it more so than ever in the big games. Man them, cast your minds and or YouTube search engines back to the big games in his Real days, like the 2011 Copa Final, 2014 UCL Final, the string of Clásicos, Madrid derbies and UCL nights. This man took the tightest of twos and trios in tandem and taunted, tortured, twisted and turned them to tatters on the regs. And yeah, I genuinely don't think I've heard one player ever say he was their toughest opponent. And yes, don't worry, I need not to be reminded of how strong the competition was at the time as far far as world-class wide players / number 10s, and I have no issues with defenders from that era picking Messi or Ronaldo. But outside that, how many more players can you genuinely name that was more consistent when it came to humiliating defenders? See it, people. See it clear. Number 3, David Beckham. 846 games, 146 goals, has almost as many assists for England as Gerrard, Lampard and Scholes combined. As a matter of fact, out of the 32 goals England scored in major tournaments while he was on the pitch, Beck's counting pre-assists was involved in 20 of them. That's over 60% of a nation's goals in major tournaments going through one man. And yet not one man has ever said he was the toughest opponent they've faced. That objectively makes no fucking sense. And that's coming from someone who knows why he's not deemed as a tough opponent. Bex didn't run past people. He was busy running after people. Bex didn't step over, flip-flap and break defenders' ankles. He was busy taking corners, free kicks, and while doing so trying not to break his own ankles. But all that aside, bottom line is this. Using Bex not dribbling against him is as clear proof of one's inability to understand the game as you'll see. Cause you see, the only reason players in that 4-4-2 system dribbled was so they can create enough space to put a cross in. Bex was able to put accurate crosses in without even needing to get past anyone. Meaning, he didn't need to dribble. So in essence, fullbacks were kinda humiliated in worse fashion by him. Bro, you man didn't even get dribbled and you still couldn't stop him. Have shame. And on that note, number 2, Nemanja Vidic. So what's going on? Right, look, firstly, as I said, underrated players are the ones who didn't necessarily play against you and leave a proper impression. And as I also said, the Di Maria case was strange because he actually did that. Well, Vidic not only also did that, but that was almost the entirety of his game. Getting up against you and at any cost, getting to the ball before you. Secondly, the majority of these players are underrated in the sense that they're not spoken as tough as much as they perhaps deserve to be by their competitors. Vidic, for a change, is spoken about, but spoken about in negative light. But it doesn't even end here, because my friends, when we say he's spoken about in negative light, this isn't the same as Wayne Rooney saying Thiago Silva was pretty comfortable to play against, or Alan Shearer saying Sol Campbell was easy to drag out opposition, or even Rio Ferdinand saying Torres didn't give him many problems. Nothing like that. Vidic was called an easy opponent by Agbon Lahore and Gary Taylor Fletcher. Yup, the man who marshalled the best defense in the league to the title, captained the biggest club in the country and left as a legend of the English game, has been deemed as light work by a guy whose last 3 clubs were Accrington, Llandudno and Bangor City. Liar. Number 1, Gilberto Silva. We began with one classic case of a Premier League player being underrated by opponents because he didn't play up against you, and we end with probably the most classic case of that sort. You see, ever since the Invincibles disbanded about 20 years ago, we have had plenty of stories about Patrick Vieira running games up and down the country, with his battles against the likes of Roy Keane and Steven Gerrard now being stuff of legend. But in his own way, Vieira's midfield partner Gilberto Silva may have caused the opposition even more problems. Nicknamed the Invisible Wall, Gilberto Silva was a defensive midfielder that very rarely went in for a crunching tackle, very rarely rushed into a 50-50, very rarely even broke stride. He simply stepped back, watched his opponents come towards him, interjected at the right times, breaking down attacks before they reached the danger zone. This man was one of the main reasons why the Invincibles also had the best defensive record in the country on top of all the attacking exploits. He kept it clean, he kept it simple. And yes, while that didn't go very far as him leaving an eternal impression on his opponents, if it wasn't for him, the Gunners most likely wouldn't have reached a milestone their fans will cherish for eternity and a day. And probably about for 2 minutes longer just for the sake of being annoying, which they f***ing are, aren't they? And that is that. Agree or disagree? Beats indifference. So what do you think of this list? Are there any other players who were underrated by opponents that I missed out? Let me know in the comments below. And as usual, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Till next time, you keep rolling.